Good day, everyone. I am Ritz Elder Malinag, and along with my group mates, Miss Hoxon, Miss Hover, Mr. Humamoy, and Miss Kim, we will be presenting our topic, which is comparison and contrast, an organizational pattern. Next slide, please. So before we kick things off, here we have the overview of our report. We have the introduction, the recalling of comparison and contrast, the steps in comparing and contrasting, the ways of comparing and contrasting using graphics, example of comparison and contrast in BAL context, the effectiveness of comparison and contrast, and lastly, the conclusion. Next slide, please. So before we start, so here is the introduction. We have the comparison and contrast. So it is a commonly used organizational pattern in technical writing. So what this means is that it in professional fields like in science, business, and engineering, they also regularly use comparison and contrast. They mostly use it to structure their reports and proposals. So this comparison and contrast is particularly useful when explaining concepts, analyzing text, and presenting information in a clear and systematic manner. So it can help break down complex ideas by showing how they relate to something familiar, and it also allows writers to present large amount of information in an organized and easy to follow structure. In the BAL program, comparison and contrast plays an important role in various areas of study, such as linguistics, writing, and literature. So students in the BAL program use this pattern across multiple subjects. Like, for example, in linguistics, they can compare language theories. In writing, they can analyze different styles or genres. And in literature, they can contrast themes or characters. Next slide, please. So recalling comparison and contrast. So before we move on, we have, of course, the definition of comparison and contrast. So comparison is the process of comparing two or more people or things. So this refers to the act of identifying similarities. It answers the question, what do these subjects have in common? And contrast, on the other hand, is comparing while highlighting the differences of two or more people or things. It is a type of comparison that focuses specifically on what sets the subjects apart. It answers the question, how are these subjects different? The compare and contrast pattern is used to describe and evaluate two or more items or options. So this pattern can serve two main purposes. Um, the first one is, of course, description. It explains what each item is. And the second one is evaluation. It can judge which item is better or just simply explaining what a specific goal is. Next slide, please. So next, we have the steps in comparing and contrasting. The first step is to select subjects that are comparable. The items must belong to the same general category, of course, and without the comparability of the items, the analysis becomes meaningless. So the second step is to determine the basis or criteria for comparison. You must decide on specific points to analyze, such as structure, purpose, or style. The criteria acts as the framework that keeps the comparison focused and fair. The third step is uh, wait, wait. So the third step is to decide on an appropriate organization method. So what this means is that you need to choose how to arrange your content, whole by whole or part by part. So whole by whole and part by part will be discussed later on. And step number four, we have present similarities and differences evenly and objectively. So we must avoid bias by giving equal attention and fair treatment to two or for the subjects that you are trying to compare. The goal is to inform, not to favor one side without evidence. And the last step is to use clear comparison and contrast signal words to guide readers. So, words like similarly, on the other hand, while, and unlike act as guide words. They help the readers follow whether you are showing a similarity or a difference. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the next topic will be presented by my co-reporter, Miss Kim.
So, good afternoon, everyone. After discussing the steps in comparing and contrasting, such as selecting comparable subjects and identifying clear criteria, we now move on to different ways we can organize our comparison. The ways of comparing and contrasting. The first organization pattern is whole by whole pattern. This pattern provides a coherent pictures of each option. This pattern works best if your pattern needs an overall assessment of each option. In this method, we discuss one subject completely before moving to the second subject. This means we present all the important criteria of all the first item first, such as its focus, method, and application, before discussing the second item using the same set of criteria. Like, for example, in our presentation, we compare structural linguistic and functional linguistic. Using the whole by whole pattern, we first explain structural linguistics in terms of its focus, method, its application. We fully describe it so that the audience can understand it clearly. After the explanation of structural linguistics, we then move on to the functional linguistics. Again, we discuss its focus, method, and application in a complete way. This pattern provides a coherent and organized picture of each subject. It allows the audience to fully understand one concept before introducing another. It is best used when we give an overall assessment of each subject, the topics, complex, and next full explanation. So we want to avoid confusion by separating the discussion clearly. However, one limitation is that the audience may forget the details of the first subject by the time the second subject is discussed. That is why clear transitions and summarize are important. Next slide, please. Now, the second organizational pattern is part by part pattern. It lets you focus on attention on the criteria. This pattern is best when you want detailed comparison and contrast. Unlike the whole by whole pattern method, this pattern focuses on one criterion at a time. Instead of discussing one subject fully, we compared both subjects under each category. For example, we begin by comparing structural linguistic and functional linguistic in terms of focus. We explain how each theory views language. Now, the next one is we compare them in terms of method, discussing how each approach analyzes language. Then we compare their application, explaining how each theory is used in real life language studies. This pattern allows audience to clearly see similarities and differences side by side because these subjects are compared immediately under the same category. It becomes easier to analyze and evaluate them. This one is best used when we want detailed comparison, we want to highlight specific similarities and differences, and the criteria are very important in the discussion. However, this pattern requires careful organization. If it's not done properly, this pattern may confuse the audience. So, to summarize, these both patterns are effective depending on purpose of your writing. The whole by whole pattern discusses one subject completely before moving to another. It gives a big picture understanding, and on the other hand, the part by part pattern compares subject point by point based on criteria. It highlights detailed similarities and differences in In the Bachelor of Arts in English Language program, both patterns are useful, especially when analyzing linguistic theories, written and spoken discourse, and other academic topics. Choosing the right pattern helps make our comparison clear, objective, and meaningful. So that's all for my part. And now, Ms. Hover will discuss the next topic.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I am Jonna Maybe Hoover, and I will discuss the comparing and contrast using graphics. So, first we have here the Venn diagram, which showing similarities and differences clearly, and it is used to visually organize information to see the relationship between sets of items such as commonalities and differences. It is used often in literature comparison, linguistic theory comparison, and cultural studies. So, to compare two or more choices and clearly see what they have in common versus what might distinguish them, let's have an example here. So, as you can see on both sides, it shows the differences between two linguistics, while on the middle you can see the similarities of both linguistics. Next is a comparison tables. It is a two-column chart which is used in research papers, technical writing, textbook explanations. So columns are usually represent the items being compared, while the rows represent the criteria or features you're comparing. So, for example, the first column is usually criteria and it lists the specific aspects such as focus, method, and application. These criteria serve as the standards for examining each item. The next column contains the items being compared, such as item A and item B, and then each row then allows the writer to compare both items according to one specific criterion at a time. So next is the whole by whole versus part by part chart. This is best for teaching organization patterns, explaining writing structures. The whole by whole pattern the whole by whole pattern discusses on all aspects of one item first before moving to the next item. For example, under whole by whole, you present item A and explain criterion 1 and criterion 2 completely, and after finishing item A, you then discuss item B, again explaining criterion 1 and criterion 2. So for the part by part pattern, also called point by point, it organizes information by criteria instead of item. It begins with criteria 1 and compares item A and item B under that same criterion. Then moves to criterion 2 and again compares both items side by side. So the key difference of whole by whole and part by part is that whole by whole focuses on one complete subjects at a time, while part by part focuses on one criterion at a time. So last, we have a matrix diagram. It is a more advanced version of a comparison table, and it is used to show the relationship between two or more sets of elements in a grid format. It looks like a table, but its main purpose is not just comparison, it is to show connections, correlations, or relationships between variables. It is used in research methodology, thesis writing, and corpus analysis comparison. So you see the example here. It is a matrix comparing different CMC theories that includes the categories such as the proponents, the focus of the theory, the key concepts, the examples or applications, the strengths and limitations. That's it for my report. Next topic will be discussed by Mr. Hamon.
Okay. Actually,
Ay, magaling.
yes.
Sorry.
Okay. So, since you're already done with our graphics on how to compare and contrast and how it is visually positioned in our documents, especially in technical writing, we have now the example of comparison and contrast in BAEL context. So here we have a very basic example of that is spoken language versus written language. So as a BAEL student, of course, language is the primary tool humans use to communicate thoughts, ideas, and emotions. So the two main forms, spoken and written language, are the very basic concepts in language study because they are the most common ways people communicate in everyday language in academic settings. Although both spoken and written language serve the main purpose of surveying meaning, they differ in how they are produced, delivered, and understood. So comparing and contrasting spoken and written language helps students understand how communication works in different contexts. This also allows learners, especially in the VA English language, our program, to analyze how language structure, vocabulary, and interaction vary depending on whether communication is spoken or written. So based on this presentation, we are going to be, or I'm going to be presenting to you the different criteria for comparing and contrasting spoken and written language while we follow the steps on how to compare and contrast. So please, next slide. All right. So the presentation, of course, selects spoken and written language. So because of that, we have here already pointed out the different criteria for our spoken and written language. So we have here mode, permanence, permanence, planning, structure, vocabulary, and interaction. And both of these have two different categories for our spoken and written. So that is audio versus visual for mode, temporary versus permanent for permanence, spontaneous versus revised for planning, fragmented versus organized for structure, informal versus formal for vocabulary, and immediate versus delayed for interaction. So these criteria ensure that the comparison is fair and systematic. You are not just randomly describing features, you are also evaluating both subjects using the same standards. So this prevents misleading comparison, which is normally what we try to avoid, especially when we're trying to objectively compare and contrast both subjects that are in the same category but quite different when it comes to their features and their certain details. Okay, so let's move on now to the next slide, please. Okay, so we have here an example. This is just a written out paragraph for how comparison and contrast happens when we are trying to create a paragraph. So I'll read. So both spoken and written language are systems used to communicate meaning. Okay, in the same way, they can be recorded and preserved. Similarly, they can be prepared in advance depending on context. Likewise, they follow grammatical rules, use the same lexicon of a language, and are shaped by audience and communicative purpose. So, just for for informative purposes, I've pointed out the different criteria in the paragraph itself, so that it would be easier to spot where the criteria falls of when we pointed out in the previous slide. Okay, you also see here that there are a lot of, or there are some words that are bold, uh, uh, have bold formats. They are indicators that both subjects have the same features per se. And yeah, we extend that discussion to the next slide. The next slide, please. Okay. So you can see here, there are signal words or phrases like similarly, likewise, both, and in the same way, they, like, and, just as. So when if you can remember in the steps on how to compare and contrast, there is one part or one step there that you can identify a certain comparing and contrasting if you are comparing both their similarities or their differences. So with comparison, you use certain signal words to indicate that they have the similarity with their features, like what we have just pointed out in the paragraph. Okay, next slide. That is for the comparison. Now we have next slide for contrast. Okay, so for contrast, again, I've mapped out a paragraph so that you can see it, the example in action. So spoken language is auditory, whereas written language is visual. Spoken language is temporary. In contrast, written language is permanent and recorded. So spoken language is usually spontaneous. On the other hand, written language is planned and revised. Spoken language is often less structured and may include fillers. However, written language is more organized and complex. Spoken language tends to use informal vocabulary, meanwhile, written language uses more formal and precise vocabulary. Spoken language allows immediate feedback, whereas written language usually has delayed or no immediate response. So again, we mapped out the different criteria all throughout this paragraph. And as you can see, again, there are bold formats for certain text here, which are signal words identifying or showing that we are trying to compare two different features of spoken and written language. So on the next slide, please. Okay. So here are the different signal words or phrases that we used in the previous paragraph. So we have however or in contrast. We also have on the other hand, whereas or while, unlike, yet or but, and although or even though. So actually for our both paragraphs there, it's just one example on how we are able to show the organizational method. So if you're just plainly going to write an essay with regards to the comparing and contrasting of spoken or written language, or just any other topics in the BAEL course, in the BAEL program, I mean, you can be able to just map out a certain paragraph like that with signal words that could indicate comparison or contrast. All right. But we also have other ways to show our comparing and contrasting of two different subjects, such as spoken and written language. So next slide, please.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
Next,
Ah,
sorry.
yeah, next, yes, next.
The lady has headset.
Okay, so we also have here another way to show comparison and contrast, especially when we're talking about two specific topics with our examples, spoken and written language. So what I've just showed you earlier is how to map out a comparison and contrast with paragraphs. Now we have whole by whole and part by part. So for our whole by whole, okay, as what my previous reporters, Miss Hover and Miss Kim, have explained or discussed earlier, okay, we have here the spoken language and then the written language, both written on top, and then underneath them are the criteria on how they're going to be compared and contrast. So that's just one way to show the differences and as well as the similarities of both topics. And if you want to be more precise and detailed with your comparison and then your contrast of the two topics, we also have here the part by part. You map out the different criteria per list, and then underneath it, you're going to point out what is the difference between spoken and then written. So as you can see here, for mode, spoken is auditory and then written is visual. That's same goes with permanence and then planning of course, structure, vocabulary, and interaction. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we also have another way to present your organizational pattern of comparison and contrast. You have here a Venn diagram, like what is explained earlier. You have two circles that you're going to use, and in the middle of that is the similarity, which you're going to point out based on the two features of your two specific topics. So for spoken and then written, there are the differences at the left and right circles. Okay, and you can see here the different criteria that we have pointed out, but they are not really strictly defined, like for example, mode, permanence, like interaction, all that. It's just the what really is the different features that you can see in both spoken and written language. And I would also say that for Venn diagram, it is kind of like a loose way of on how to compare and contrast two things, because you're just like brainstorming the different differences as well as the similarities of both subjects that you have chosen. Okay, so that's another example. And then for next slide, please. Okay, we also have here the comparison table. Okay, and again, like what Miss Hover said, we have here for the comparison table, the first row is for the criteria. So we map out here the criteria that we have pointed out. So mode, permanence, planning, structure, vocabulary, and interaction. And then for spoken and then written, you point out the differences mainly of these two topics that you are comparing and contrasting. Okay, and then for the last one, next one, next slide, please. Oh, okay. So I guess that's it for my report. That was the last way on how to be able to present your organizational patterns, such as comparing and contrasting. Now we have Mr. Neil Humamboy to continue on with the report for effectiveness of comparing and contrasting. Thank you.
So, good day everyone. Today I will explaining how comparison is used in English to clarify meaning and reduce confusion and show language change. The first one is when the subject are often confused or mistaken. If people mix up two or more things, comparison clarifies boundaries and prevent errors. In English, some terms mistaken for each other. Comparisons help clarify their boundaries. For example, students often confuse phonetics and phonology. In phonetics, studies the physical production and sound of speech, while the phonology how sounds function within a language system. So, while phonology explain why speakers treat both sounds as the same phoneme. By comparing these two fields, we prevent the misunderstanding. Number two, when the reader has a knowledge gap. If your audiences knows one subject well but not the other, use the familiar to explain the unfamiliar. Comparison also helps explain unfamiliar ideas using familiar ones. For example, many people understand the difference between the formal and informal. In formal, we use the sentence, I do not know, while in informal, we use a sentence, I don't know. By comparing these two forms, we understand and the concept of register, which refers the language variation depending on context and situation. The familiar example helps explain the broader of the linguistic concept. So in the third, when the highlight what makes something unique. Sometimes the best way to define something is to explain what is not. For example, consider the difference between a sentence and a fragment. In sentence, we say the we say she completed her assignment. While in fragment, we often use because we often use sentence because she was tired. While comparing them, we see that the sentence contains a complete thought, while a fragment does not. The comparison clearly defines what makes a sentence complete. And the last one is when tracing change over time. Comparing a subject to its past self shows growth, decline, or transformation. For example, early modern English during the time of William Shakespeare used forms like thou art my friend. The thou is spelled by THOU and art literally ART, my friend. While in modern English, we say you are my friend. By comparing these forms, we observe changes in pronouns and verb forms over time. This demonstrates the language is dynamic and constantly evolving. In conclusion, the number one, when the subject are often confused or mistaken, we clarify commonly confused term. And number two, when the reader has a knowledge gap, we explain unfamiliar things concept using familiar examples. And number three, when you need to highlight what makes something unique, we highlight what makes something unique. And number four, when you are tracing change over time, we show the evolve or the language change over time. Through comparison becomes clearer, more precise, and more accurate. Next slide, please. So, in comparison and contrast is not effective when the items are obviously identical. If two or more items are essentially the same thing, comparing them adds on no value and the readers learn nothing new. For example, both English and American English use the alphabet similarly. They share most vocabulary, almost the same. However, the British English spells the color with U, where the American English spells color without U. So, British English and American English are varieties of the same language, not a separate languages at all. And number two, comparing just to add length. It reads as a filler, not a genuine analysis about the subject. So when, for example, when the prof have a assignment, a student essay on the Great Vowel Shift includes lengthy comparison between English changes and German vowel changes. Even though the assignment is specifically about the English and the student has not studied German historical phonology in depth, it fails. Why it fails? It reads as fillers, not genuine analysis. The instructor or the professor might think You clearly added this to reach the page count. So let's move on to number three. When it is unfair or misleading, you are comparing items in an unequal footing using different criteria, different time periods, or different conditions. So, for example, English has a larger vocabulary than Icelandic, with over 600,000 words compared to Iceland's 50,000. This compares dictionary entries, not actual language use. The comparison is methodologically unsound and favor to English language unfairly. So, in conclusion, number one, when the items are obviously identical, you need it is you don't need to compare the two when it is obviously identical. And number two, comparing just to add the length, you don't need to add length for have a genuine analysis about the subject. And number three, when it is unfair or mislead, you don't need just compare one to another just to have the one subject unfairly treatable. That's all. And for the conclusion will be reported by my co-reporter.
Right. So again, thank you. So in conclusion, for our report, comparing and contrast is an essential organizational pattern in academic and of course technical writing. It is a fundamental analytical skill in the BA English Language program. And through this presentation, we demonstrated how spoken and written language can be systematically examined using clear criteria such as mode, permanence, planning, structure, vocabulary, and interaction. So by following the steps in comparing and contrasting, selecting comparable subjects, identifying criteria, choosing an organizational pattern or method, presenting similarities and differences objectively, and using signal words and graphics, we ensure that our analysis is and fair. Structured, fair, and meaningful, I mean. So in BA English Language Program or BAL, so this method is especially important because students constantly analyze linguistic theories, discourse types, and language varieties or variations. So for example, distinguishing spoken from written language helps students understand how context influences grammar, vocabulary, and interaction. Rather than simply describing each form, we also allow ourselves to see relationships, boundaries, and unique characteristics more clearly. So, moreover, this organizational pattern strengthens critical thinking. It trains students to evaluate information carefully, avoid bias, and apply consistent criteria. These skills are essential not only in academic writing, but also in research, thesis writing, and professional communication. So ultimately, comparison and contrast uh, enhances clarity, depth, and analytical precision, which are core competencies in English language studies. So by mastering this pattern, BAL students become more effective writers, researchers, and language analysts. So hopefully you guys are well informed about our topic about comparison and contrast, and hopefully some of the ways that we have presented to you will be helpful in how you're going to present your future schoolwork, say for example your thesis or just any academic paper that you're going to have. And hopefully, you will be able to effectively show the differences as well as similarities of um, two subjects in BAL program that are in the same category. All right, so that's all. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you.